Imagine stepping onto a train in Kingston and arriving in Montego Bay 90 minutes later. Not 4 hours stuck in traffic, not dealing with winding mountain roads, but a smooth, effortless journey across the island at speeds that would transform Jamaica forever. It sounds like a dream, doesn't it? But here's the reality. Building this dream would cost anywhere between $9 and $18 billion. To put that in perspective, Jamaica's entire economy produces just under $20 billion a year. So the question isn't just whether Jamaica should build a high-speed rail network. The question is whether they can actually afford it without crippling their economy for decades to come. Before we dive deeper, if you're enjoying this analysis and want to see more content exploring ambitious infrastructure projects around the world, please hit that subscribe button. We're working hard to reach 5,000 subscribers, and your support helps us bring you more fascinating stories like this one. Now, let's get into the numbers. The idea of a high-speed rail network in Jamaica isn't completely far-fetched. The island is small enough that a well-designed system could connect every major population center within hours. But small doesn't mean simple. Jamaica is a mountainous island with terrain that would make even experienced engineers nervous. The Blue Mountains rise over 2,000 meters in the east. The coastlines are prone to flooding and erosion. The interior is riddled with limestone caves and sinkholes that can collapse without warning. None of this is easy ground to build on, and all of it drives up costs dramatically. So let's start with the most practical approach. If Jamaica were serious about building high-speed rail, the first step would be defining exactly what that system would look like. A realistic design would involve a main corridor connecting Kingston in the southeast to Montego Bay in the northwest, with additional branches reaching Ocho Rios on the north coast, Negril at the western tip, Port Antonio in the northeast, and Manville in the central interior. These 6 points cover the capital, the largest tourism hubs, and the key population centers. Together, they form the economic backbone of the island. Link them by rail, and you've effectively linked the entire country. The smartest way to build this network would be to follow the existing highway corridors. Jamaica's modern highways were carefully engineered over decades. Engineers studied the terrain, identified the safest routes, bypassed flood zones, avoided the steepest slopes, and worked around dense communities. All of that research and planning is already done. A railway running parallel to these highways would benefit from the same terrain advantages without having to repeat the same expensive studies. It would also dramatically reduce the cost of land acquisition, which is often one of the biggest expenses in any infrastructure project. Instead of carving through untouched land and negotiating with hundreds of property owners, the rail line could stay close to land that's already designated for transportation use. Following the highway network, a complete east-to-west rail line with several branch connections would stretch approximately 400 to 450 kilometers. That's the baseline figure we need to estimate costs. And this is where things get sobering. High-speed rail is one of the most expensive types of infrastructure on Earth. The costs vary wildly depending on where you build, but international data gives us some useful benchmarks. China, which has built more high-speed rail than any other country, averages around $17 to $21 million per kilometer. They've achieved these costs through ruthless standardization, mass production of components, and favorable terrain across much of their rail network. European countries like France and Spain, where labor costs are higher and terrain is more challenging, typically spend between $25 and $35 million per kilometer. Then there's the United States, where the California high-speed rail project has become infamous for its ballooning costs. Current estimates put that project at $50 to $70 million per kilometer, and some sections are even higher. Jamaica would likely fall somewhere between China and Europe on this scale. Labor costs in Jamaica are lower than in the United States or Western Europe, which helps. But the terrain is far more difficult than the flat plains where China built much of its network. Mountains, coastlines, unstable limestone geology, all of these factors mean more tunnels, more bridges, more reinforced foundations, and more engineering complexity. A reasonable working estimate would be $20 to $40 million per kilometer, depending on the specific section being built. Now let's apply those numbers to the 450-kilometer network. At the low end, if Jamaica could somehow match China's efficiency and spend just $20 million per kilometer, the total cost would be around $9 billion. At the middle estimate of $30 million per kilometer, you're looking at $13.5 billion. At the high end, with $40 million per kilometer, the price climbs to $18 billion. Remember, Jamaica's GDP in 2024 was just under $20 billion. That means this single project could cost anywhere from half the size of the entire annual economy to nearly matching it. These are numbers that would strain even a wealthy developed nation, let alone a small island economy still recovering from decades of debt challenges. This is why almost every country that builds high-speed rail does it in phases. You don't build the entire network at once. You start with the most important corridor, prove the concept, generate revenue, and then expand gradually. For Jamaica, the most logical first phase would be the Kingston to Montego Bay route. This is the single busiest transportation corridor on the island. Right now, that journey takes 4 to 5 hours by car, depending on traffic and road conditions. High-speed rail could cut that down to about 90 minutes. For business travelers, tourists, and commuters, that's a transformative difference. The Kingston to Montego Bay section is roughly 200 kilometers. Using the middle estimate of $30 million per kilometer, that first phase would cost approximately $6 billion. Still an enormous sum, but more manageable than trying to build everything at once. Later phases could extend the line northeast to Port Antonio, north to Ocho Rios, west to Negril, and inland to Manville. Each extension could be funded and built separately, spreading the financial burden over years or even decades. But even with a phased approach, there are sections where costs would spike well above the average. The eastern route toward Port Antonio would have to cut through some of the most mountainous terrain on the island. That means extensive tunneling through solid rock, which is extraordinarily expensive. The northern coastal routes to Ocho Rios and beyond face different challenges. Flooding, erosion, storm surge risk, all of these require elevated tracks or extensive coastal reinforcement. The interior route to Manville crosses rugged limestone country riddled with underground cave systems and sinkholes. Building on unstable karst geology requires deep foundation work and constant geological monitoring. Each of these challenges pushes costs upward. Some flat, straightforward sections might come in at $20 million per kilometer, but difficult sections could easily exceed $50 or $60 million per kilometer, especially if unexpected geological problems emerge during construction. This explains why the full island-wide system has such a wide cost range. Until engineers conduct detailed surveys of every kilometer, it's impossible to know exactly where the expensive surprises will appear. Assuming Jamaica decided to move forward, the next critical question is how to pay for it. The country could issue government bonds to raise the money, but that's a risky path. Jamaica has a complicated history with debt. For years, the country struggled under a debt-to-GDP ratio that exceeded 130%. After nearly a decade of painful fiscal restructuring and reforms, Jamaica has finally brought that ratio down. As of 2024, the debt-to-GDP ratio stands at approximately 62% under revised methodology, a remarkable achievement. Taking on another $9 to $18 billion in debt would reverse years of progress and push the ratio right back toward dangerous levels. International lenders would be nervous, credit ratings could fall, and the cost of borrowing would increase for everything else the government wants to do. Another option is a public-private partnership, where private investors build and operate the rail line in exchange for long-term revenue rights. This model has been used successfully in places like the United Kingdom, India, and parts of Southeast Asia. The advantage is that it keeps the debt off the government's books and brings in private sector expertise. The downside is that private investors demand returns. That means ticket prices would likely be higher than if the government ran it as a public service. It also means that if ridership falls short of projections, the government might still end up having to bail out the project to prevent it from collapsing. International loans are another possibility. China has financed railway projects across Africa, Latin America, and Asia as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. These loans can be attractive because they often come with Chinese construction firms and equipment, which can speed up the process. But they also come with long repayment periods and political strings attached. Organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank also fund large infrastructure projects, typically with more favorable terms and fewer political complications. Each option has trade-offs. Private investment demands profit. Foreign loans create decades of repayment obligations. Government bonds risk reversing years of debt reduction. Whichever path Jamaica chose, the fundamental question remains the same. Would the railway generate enough revenue to justify the cost? Ticket sales are the most obvious income stream. If the Kingston to Montego Bay trip truly takes just 90 minutes, many Jamaicans would gladly choose the train over driving. Tourists would use it too, especially those flying into Kingston who want to reach the northern resort areas quickly without dealing with rental cars and unfamiliar roads. Daily commuters between major towns could also rely on it for work and business travel. If ticket prices are affordable, ridership could be strong. Freight is another potential revenue stream. High-speed rail systems aren't typically designed for heavy freight, but many countries run cargo trains on the same tracks during off-peak hours. Jamaica imports a huge amount of goods through its ports, and agricultural products need to move from rural areas to urban markets. Using rail for freight would reduce truck traffic on highways, cutting road maintenance costs and lowering transportation expenses for businesses. It would also reduce fuel consumption and emissions, which aligns with global climate goals. But here's the harsh reality. High-speed rail almost never pays for itself directly. Even the most successful systems in the world, places like Japan, France, and Spain, require government subsidies to keep running. Operating costs are enormous. Tracks need constant inspection and maintenance. Signaling systems require regular upgrades to stay safe and efficient. The trains themselves are incredibly expensive to purchase and maintain. Specialized technicians are needed to keep everything running smoothly. All of this costs money, and ticket revenue rarely covers it completely. If Jamaica built a high-speed rail system, it would need a long-term financial plan not just for construction, but for operation and maintenance over decades. Without that plan, the system could fall into disrepair within years, becoming a monument to wasted money rather than a functioning piece of infrastructure. Unfortunately, this has happened in many developing countries that built ambitious rail systems without budgeting properly for upkeep. Trains sit idle, tracks deteriorate, stations crumble. The dream dies slowly from neglect. That said, the economic benefits of high-speed rail extend far beyond ticket sales. In the short term, construction alone would create one of the largest job creation efforts in Jamaican history. Tens of thousands of workers would be needed. Engineers, surveyors, construction laborers, electricians, welders, logistics coordinators, the list goes on. The demand for construction materials like concrete, steel, copper wiring, and electronic components would provide a huge boost to local suppliers and manufacturers. Money spent on the project would ripple through communities across the island, creating a temporary but powerful economic lift during the construction phase. In the long term, The reduction in travel time could fundamentally change how the economy functions. Businesses that currently operate only in Kingston or Montego Bay could expand into other regions more easily. A company based in the capital could have employees commute from Manville or Ocho Rios without losing hours every day to traffic. Suppliers and customers could meet face-to-face more frequently without the logistical nightmare of long drives. This kind of connectivity tends to spread economic activity more evenly across a country rather than concentrating it in just one or two cities. Tourism could expand significantly. Right now, many visitors to Jamaica fly into Montego Bay and stay in that region because traveling across the island is inconvenient. If getting from Kingston to Negril took 2 hours instead of 5, tourists could explore more of the country during their stay. They could visit historical sites in the capital, relax on the beaches in Negril, and explore the mountains in Portland all in one trip. More tourism means more jobs in hospitality, restaurants, transportation, and entertainment. People living outside the main cities would gain access to better job opportunities and educational institutions. Right now, if you live in a small town in rural Jamaica, your options are limited. Moving to Kingston for work or university is expensive and disruptive. But if you could commute in 90 minutes, suddenly, those opportunities become accessible. This kind of connectivity helps reduce inequality by spreading opportunity beyond the wealthy urban centers. Freight efficiency could also lower the cost of goods across the island. Transportation costs are baked into the price of everything you buy. If it costs less to move food, clothing, electronics, and building materials around the island, those savings get passed on to consumers. For a country where many people live on tight budgets, even small reductions in the cost of living can make a meaningful difference. The overall effect could be stronger national productivity and higher GDP growth. Better connectivity means businesses operate more efficiently. Workers have access to more opportunities. Goods move faster and cheaper. All of this adds up to a more dynamic, competitive economy. Some economists estimate that major infrastructure improvements like high-speed rail can boost long-term GDP growth by 0.5 percentage point or more annually. Over decades, that compounds into significant gains. But we can't ignore the risks because they're substantial. The first and most obvious risk is debt. Borrowing billions of dollars would weigh heavily on Jamaica's economy for decades. Even with a phased approach, taking on $6 billion for the first phase alone would strain the government's finances. If the project goes over budget, as most large infrastructure projects do, that strain gets worse. And if the railway doesn't generate the expected revenue, the government would be stuck paying for it anyway, which means cuts to other programs like healthcare, education, or social services. The second risk is ridership. Jamaica's entire population is just under 3 million people. Even with affordable tickets and excellent service, it's uncertain whether enough people would use the system regularly to justify the investment. If ridership falls short of projections, ticket revenue drops and the financial case for the project collapses. Private investors would demand bailouts. International lenders would still expect repayment. The government would be left holding the bill. The third risk is maintenance. Building the railway is only the beginning. Keeping it safe and functional for decades requires sustained investment. If the government struggles to budget for maintenance, the system could deteriorate quickly. Deferred maintenance leads to breakdowns, accidents, and eventually the shutdown of sections of track. This has happened in countries around the world that built rail systems without planning for long-term upkeep. The fourth risk is opportunity cost. For the same $9 to $18 billion, Jamaica could invest in other priorities that might deliver stronger returns with less risk. Energy independence, for example. Jamaica imports nearly all of its energy, which makes the economy vulnerable to global oil price shocks. Investing in solar, wind and natural gas infrastructure could reduce that dependence, lower electricity costs, and create jobs. Port expansion is another option. Jamaica's ports are critical to trade, and upgrading them could attract more shipping business and boost exports. Healthcare and education are perennial needs. Better hospitals, more teachers, improved school facilities, all of these investments have clear, measurable benefits for quality of life and economic productivity. High-speed rail is exciting. It's visible. It's transformative. But it's also enormously expensive and risky. The question isn't whether Jamaica could physically build a rail network. With enough money and time, almost anything is possible. The real question is whether it's the best use of limited resources. Would the economic benefits outweigh the costs? Would ridership be high enough to justify the investment? Could the government maintain the system over decades without letting it fall apart? And most importantly, would spending billions on rail leave Jamaica better off than spending that money on other priorities? These are questions without easy answers. Every major infrastructure project involves trade-offs. You gain connectivity but take on debt. You create jobs but risk overruns. You dream of transformation but face the reality of budgets and politics. Jamaica has made remarkable progress in recent years, reducing its debt burden and stabilizing its economy. Taking on a project this large could either accelerate that progress or reverse it entirely. The decision requires not just engineering studies and cost estimates, but a clear-eyed assessment of what the country truly needs and can realistically afford. So can Jamaica afford to build a high-speed rail network? Technically, yes. With international loans, private investment, or government bonds, the money could be raised. But should they? That's a far more complicated question. The answer depends on whether the economic benefits justify the risks, whether the government can commit to decades of maintenance, and whether this is truly the best use of billions of dollars that could go toward energy, healthcare, education, or debt reduction. For now, high-speed rail in Jamaica remains an ambitious dream. Whether it becomes reality will depend on political will, financial discipline, and a clear-headed calculation of what the island truly needs for its future.